this subject, I think, is something you see often in polyglot discussions. The potential effects of language switching between language, on your self-concept or your identity, who you think you are, and personality expression. We're going to examine the so-called scientific evidence here. Question, just if you show me by raising your hand, do you sometimes feel different when speaking certain languages? Not everybody, but majority. Okay. Multilingual, multicultural individuals may experience a change in perceptions, feelings, judgment, and behavior when switching from one linguistic, cultural context to another. Now you're going to see that I continuously put the two together, right? Language and culture. I say linguistic, cultural context. It's very important here. Okay, so it's modulated or it's affected, increased or decreased, by the degree of proficiency. And importantly, the degree of assimilation, the cultural part, of norms, values, assumptions, beliefs, expectations, and perceptions of the culture associated with the language you're switching into. I asked you to raise your hand. Some people didn't raise their hand. Either they weren't listening or they don't like to exercise. Or it's not at all for them. Okay, if it's not at all, then maybe you won't like my comments here, what it means. How did you acquire that language, that particular language that you're switching into? Was it only with learning materials, very bookish type? You're going through various applications and such. You never really spoke with anybody. You never used the language to get by in life, etc., or relationships, on and on and on. Okay? So in that case, weak or non-existent. Even though you may be able to pass a test and say, I'm B2, C1, things like that, the higher ones. You could pass that test, but yeah, it's non-existent for you because it's just here in the head, and the culture hasn't perhaps come with it. It wasn't a package. You use learning materials, and also you use the target language with native speakers. So it should be more significant, again, depends on how much. Or you have extensive interaction in the culture of the target language. So you lived in the country, etc. Okay? So the more this is true, the stronger it is. Okay, so next observation is how closely your accent, prosody, and communication patterns are similar to the native speakers of that target language. Successful native-like accent and prosody makes it strong, this possibility, okay, whether you feel it or not. The use of native-like body language and gestures. So when you're communicating, do you also imitate that? The similar communication patterns. So for example, in some cultures, you can talk while the other person is talking, and others, extreme Finnish culture, you hear it, you wait, then you say something, okay? And the degree of your emotional awareness, the degree of your social sensitivity and skills, the degree to which you have developed a new linguistic cultural identity in the target language. And this one, we're really going to focus on this one. And if you've developed this, you've done all the other. You can't develop a deep cultural linguistic identity without a lot of interaction in the target language. And the degree of your language culture ego permeability. So this is Fiora, very interesting researcher. He used alcohol tranquilizers with people to see if they could pronounce Thai language better. And they could if they were hearing it from a native speaker and not a machine. The significant difference came when there was emotions. I mentioned that because then you understand this better. I'm distinguishing between acquisition without the kind of human and emotional contact and just cerebral acquisition. Second, language learning in all its aspects demands that the individual, to a certain extent, take on a new identity. And in order to have a permeable, meaning so it's kind of language ego boundaries, you must first have a well-developed, integrated ego or sense of self in the first language. The development of this language ego directly parallels that of the general ego development. In the early stages of development, the boundaries of the language ego are in a state of flux and hence the pronunciation ability is quite malleable. One clear manifestation of this is a child who doesn't have a well-developed ego boundary, and therefore they seem to be able to imitate the accent, prosody, etc. And individual variations in the ability to approximate native-like pronunciation are in part determined by certain psychological variables which are under the concept of this ego boundary or empathy, permeability of ego boundaries. Gilchrist is really talking about left brain, right brain here, and it's an extremely interesting book. He says communication occurs because, in a necessary, limited, but nonetheless crucially important sense, we come to feel what it's like to be the other person who is communicating with us. So this explains how we begin to pick up their habits and their tics, even if we don't want to, and explains the problems of emotional entrapment in the conversation. Like it would be in therapy. You start to feel the same problems. If you speak to negative people all the time who are telling you the problems, you know how you feel, right? In everyday life, when we experience in our own frames the very feelings that the other person experiences. So empathy is associated with a greater intuitive desire to imitate. Let's talk about the strong link between language and culture, the relationship between the two. We can take a look at some quotes. Okay? Through the study of other languages, students gain knowledge and understanding of the cultures that use that language. In fact, students cannot truly master the language until they have mastered the cultural context. So language learners must be aware of the cultural and the social norms and conventions that encapsulate the communication process. Meaningful cross-cultural communication requires the ability to understand different modes of thinking, how people think in that culture, and ways of living. They embodied in the cultural Gestalt. Okay, we'll borrow that from German. You have to navigate between different modes present in any specific interaction, what's going on at that time, the situation. And this ability is labeled as intercultural communication competence. So language expresses the cultural reality in that with words people express not only their facts and ideas, but also their attitudes, perceptions, perspectives, and values. Also in language we have the cultural reality in which people give meaning to their experience through the means of communication. And it symbolizes a cultural reality since people view their language as a symbol of their social identity. The real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up in the language habits of the group. So no two languages are sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The social reality is something that's indisputable, whether we're talking about perceptual reality in general, that's something else. Okay? So the words in which different societies lie are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. So multicultural and multilingual individuals can be thought as having multiple self-concepts, multiple ways of thinking about themselves, or a linguistic, cultural linguistics identity, and each related to the language that they know. And then again, how developed this is depends on your experiences, your ability in the language, and how close do you imitate a native speaker. Okay, if you hear somebody who sounds very much like a native speaker in a particular language, you can sure bet that they also have the culture deeply within them. Okay, so multicultural individuals often need to navigate between different norms and values associated with that language and culture. And multicultural individuals possess at least two cultural frames, each based on a corresponding set of cultural experiences and knowledge. So one of the reasons that accounts for feeling different when you're speaking different languages is that the language can be a cue that activates, a prime that activates these cultural frames, these schemas, which are developed, in that culture, target language and culture. It comes to the forefront at that time. So cultural frame switching refers to the idea of interpretive frames, schemas, ways that we try to understand the world. In individuals who have internalized two cultural identities, they can shift with these situational cues. So these cultural schemas guide behavior only when they come to the foreground of one's mind. Okay, so I've lived most of my life in Japan, 38 years. But right now, I'm not really feeling Japanese. It's very strong, and sometimes I hold it back. So when I see people, I often do this. If you see me and people go, hey, and I go, like, okay, you just understand that, all right? But it's something brings it to the forefront, which could be hearing the language, seeing something that represents that culture. We'll get into that. When exposed to Chinese primes, priming the language, bringing it forward, like Chinese Americans who actually speak Chinese. If you look at a Chinese American, Japanese American, or Latino American, whatever, if they don't speak the language, it's not as strong. So if they see a dragon or Chinese calligraphy, Chinese American biculturals make more external attributions, comments about what they're looking at. And this is a typical Eastern style. However, if they're exposed to American primes, then they make more internal attributions. In psychology and cognitive science, a schema describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and relationships among them. Exposed to extreme array of complexity in the number and kinds of stimuli to which people can pay attention. So you have to choose what you're paying attention to. And people create mental or scripts that simplify the environment by reducing its complexity. The perceptual schemas assist in the automatic processing of information and guiding our interpretation, how we understand it, how we respond to a familiar social situation. They're based on values and expectations, meaning what the person you're talking to expects in terms of behavior and reaction, etc. These differences in values among cultures lead to differences in perceptual filters, what you're focusing your attention on. So what people pay attention to is how they interpret what they notice. Language and culture together tend to guide your attention. That creates your reality. Your reality is created by what you pay attention to. The more people identify with the language and culture, the greater they experience emotional sensitivity toward the language and culture. There's greater emotional attachment and reaction to stimuli representing the culture. Interaction in a specific culture and language develops memories that have emotional valences or values. When you have this memory, you have a strong feeling that goes with it. Looking at my past, over 45 years I've been around the world. I left the States in 1974. And I can remember my Brazilian experience. I really got into Brazil and I loved the music so much. And then for a number of years, once I heard any Brazilian music, all came to me, the emotions, I felt them, the experiences I had. I had a good time in Brazil. Okay, so I was young. Luna studied groups of Hispanic women who were all bilingual, but varying degrees of cultural identification. They found significant levels of frame switching, so changes in how they saw themselves, self-perception or self-identity, corresponding to high levels of biculturalism, okay? So their ability in the language, not only the ability in the language, but also their identity to the culture. So those Hispanics with high levels of participation in both Latino and Anglo culture, when cued with a particular language, English or Spanish, these individuals activate distinct sets of cultural specific concepts or mental frames, which include aspects of their identity. So those mental frames may consist of different repertoires or sets of values and behavior. What's appropriate value? How do people in that culture look at it? How do they behave in that situation? As well as separate worldviews and identities that are entwined with the language and culture, specific to the memories and experiences that they have. Okay, so you see why if you've only studied the language in the context of your room or something on a computer and didn't interact, wow, this is extremely important. Okay, so what happens? Culture and corresponding linguistic identities may be stored in separate knowledge structures and activated by interaction in the language and culture. Or again, as we saw in the case of the Chinese experiment, just primed, activated by seeing calligraphy or a Chinese dragon or something. Okay, so the emotional value or valence of the particular culture or language based on a meaning system and framing it that is part of a repertoire of meaning systems. The language and culture together is a meaning system. Multicultural, multilingual individuals may vary according to their linguistic and social cultural context of the moment. So interacting in a particular cultural language tends to bring this emotional value or valence of the meaning system, framing associated with that cultural language to the forefront, and causes emotional valence of other language to recede, go to the back. So it's a change of dominance. So when you say you feel different, it's a change of dominance at that time. So language is more than simply cue what cultural frame we adopt. It also may determine what comes to mind, what do you think of? The cue memories that determine what we pay attention to. And it influences our ability to draw distinctions, affects our perception of our behavior and our attitudes. Various studies show that those who speak more than one language perceive the world differently depending on the language being spoken, affecting not only their thoughts but also their preferences. So users of both Spanish and English complete a questionnaire to measure the big 5 personality dimensions. So extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, and neuroticism. Once in English and once in Spanish. And the researchers observed that the same pattern across 3 separate samples. When the participants completed the English version of the questionnaire, they tended to score higher on extroversion. It's relative, okay? Higher on extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, and slightly lower on neuroticism. So if you're Latino, you're more neurotic, compared with when they completed the Spanish version. From an Anglo culture, you're neurotic, not from your own culture. The researchers claim that there were no profound changes in personalities when these bilinguals switch languages. Instead, they become more extroverted when they speak English rather than Spanish. But they retain their rank order within each category. So it's a matter of degree here. They haven't become it's not Jekyll and Hyde. They haven't become a different person. But the degree to which it's expressed is different. So the results are consistent with thousands of monolingual participants who spoke either English or Spanish, that showed English speakers tended to score higher on those 3, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And analysis confirmed that these effects are not related to translation issues with the questionnaire. They're related to cultural frame switching. So in addition to cultural frame switching, cultural accommodation and cultural mindset are related explanations for this effect. Cultural accommodation simply means that you accommodate the cultural norms. Okay, you're in Rome, do as the people do in New York. No, that's not how it goes. Okay. In other words, language itself primes the multilingual's cultural specific values, attitudes, and memories, which in turn affect their behavior. Okay, so the perceived cultural norms of the group associated with the language in use activate behavioral expressions of personality that are appropriate in that situation. Some people might find that speaking a foreign language sets them free. This is a very probable feeling if someone obtains a high level of proficiency in the target language in conjunction with the development of this new linguistic cultural identity. And it comes to the forefront at a certain time, and then you feel free in the way you express yourself. I know I do it all the time because when I'm speaking Japanese, it will be very different than when I'm speaking Brazilian, Portuguese, or even English, or German's one way, and etc. Okay, Italian and German. Right? Part of the freedom comes from the absence of expectations that are present when you interact with people. If you feel free when you're interacting in a certain language which is deeply within you, you identify with it linguistically and culturally, okay, then you might feel this absence of expectations about how you should act, who you should be, etc. So in such a context, you are not only subject to the norms, values, and attitudes and expectations of the culture in general, but also to the expectations of those who know you well. Your past history with those people is an anchor. Very important one. The most important slide here.